So I'm a virologist, which means that in my work with rotavirus, I really spent about 20 years in a windowless concrete room at the Westboro Institute inoculating and sacrificing mice trying to make a rotavirus vaccine, and didn't really appreciate the this sort of skeptic society. And I didn't appreciate it, frankly, until I saw it in action for people like Joe Nickel and Barry Carr and others, when in the sort of 25 years that it took to make a rotavirus vaccine, I appreciated how hard it was to do that. And at the same time, watching people like Andrew Wakefield publish a paper in The Lancet claiming that MMR caused autism when it was, frankly, a claim that was completely unsupported by the data. I saw at once how hard it was to make a vaccine and how easy it was to damn them. And with that, I started to try and become more active in trying to weigh in, at least with the media, on this issue. And they're sort of right there all along was the skeptics group, which had active blogs and really were combating this bad information. So you guys are my heroes. I didn't know you existed until the last few years because I just wasn't paying attention, but you've done a tremendous amount. I mean, the vaccine story has largely changed, I think, in large part because of the science bloggers and those podcasts. So thank you. What I want to talk about actually is this. If you look, about 2 weeks ago, the CDC reported that we've had about 595 cases of measles in the United States this year. Now, that's a bigger outbreak than anything we've seen in about 20 years. The reason for that is that the virus is spreading among children who are unvaccinated. They're unvaccinated because their parents have chosen not to vaccinate them. I think the reason that they've chosen not to vaccinate them is they don't fear the disease. If you argue that we're compelled by fear far more than we're compelled by reason, they don't fear the disease. I mean, for the reason that not only do they generally not see these diseases today, they didn't grow up with these diseases. So for them, I think vaccination becomes a matter of faith. The fact is that despite these roughly 600 cases, I think there's probably few people that have seen, I mean, in this group, which is an older group, you probably have seen measles, but most people who are certainly less than 40 years old have never seen a case of measles, and so they don't remember it. Recently, Jenny McCarthy, who's my personal go-to person for healthcare advice, I don't know if she's yours, but she was on Larry King Live, and when asked about getting an MMR vaccine and her notion that it could force children to get autism, cause children to get autism, she said, and I quote, "I'll take the frickin' measles every time." Which tells you that not only does she not appreciate, I think, how sick measles can make you, but she doesn't even have a memory for it. To some extent, I think we've lost the memory for these diseases. And so toward that end, I want to talk about what I lived through in 1991 in the city of Philadelphia. So hopefully as a lesson from the past and not a prologue to the future. So in April 20th, 1989, at the Spectrum in Philadelphia, measles virus came into our city. After returning from a trip to Spain, a teenager with a blotchy rash attended an REM concert at the Spectrum. A couple weeks later, several other teenagers got sick. This headline on May 21st, 1990 appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer. No measly problem. Now, measles vaccine was first introduced in the United States in 1963. Prior to that vaccine, every year that virus caused frankly, between 3 and 4 million cases, roughly 48,000 hospitalizations, and 500 deaths every year. Pretty much everyone was infected by 15 years of age. When you died from pneumonia, encephalitis, or dehydration. By 1978, because of the measles vaccine, we were down to about 27,000 cases reported. Remember, from 3 to 4 million. The CDC was optimistic at this point that measles could be eliminated from the United States, so they launched the Measles Elimination Program with a goal to eliminate the disease within the next 4 years. In 1983, only 1,500 cases were reported. But in 1989, measles came back. On June 2nd, 1990, this headline appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Now, as of May 19th, 1990, there were 35 deaths from measles reported in the U.S., but there were 41 measles deaths reported for all of 1989. So the trend was for increasing numbers of deaths from measles in the U.S. On June 12th, this headline appeared in the Inquirer. State urges second measles shot for children. This was the birth, frankly, of the second dose of measles vaccine. At the time, it was only a single dose given between 12 and 15 months of age. Now, before 1990, children received one dose of measles vaccine at around 15 months of age. The CDC was now recommending a second dose in middle school, primarily to give children a second chance to get a first dose. And that increased the efficacy of the vaccine from about 95% to close to 99.5%. Now, in Philadelphia, by November 29th of 1990, 96 Philadelphia children were infected with measles. By December 7th, that number was 124. By December 31st, that increased to 258. In December of 1990, an 18-month-old boy dies from measles pneumonia. It was the first measles death in our city in 20 years. On June 12, 1990, this headline appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer. North Philadelphia baby death linked to measles. Now, this was the second death then in our city. Both measles deaths occurred in children who were unimmunized. At this point, the Philadelphia Health Commissioner recommended that the first dose of vaccine should be given at 6 months of age, at a time when it was reasoned that maternal immunity from the mother that would be passively transferred to the child transplacentally would have waned enough so that 6 months you would still have a response. 7 weeks later, city health officials will do something that had never been done before and has never been done since. This was the most amazing part of the Philadelphia story, and we'll get to it. Now, the Commissioner of Health for the city of Philadelphia at the time was Bob Ross. On January 16th of 1991, Ross receives an anonymous phone call from a woman whose daughter belongs to the Faith Tabernacle Church in North Philadelphia. The woman warns Ross that church members don't believe in medical care. No one had died yet, said Ross, but for the first time we worry that we might not hear about a case of measles until a church member calls the police or calls the coroner to pick up the body. Now, the Faith Tabernacle Church's doctrine instructs members to, quote, believe that the Bible is opposed to all means of healing apart from God's way. If I go to God and ask him to heal my body, says church member Gordon Korn, I can't go to a doctor for medicine. You either trust God or you trust man. Now, at the time, the church school, the Faith Tabernacle Church School, contained hundreds of children, none of whom are immunized. None of whom are immunized. This is a picture of the Faith Tabernacle Church, which still exists actually in North Philadelphia. They have still a vigorous congregation. They're at 5th and Erie, for those of you who know the city. On February 11th, 1991, measles kills 2 church school pupils. So, and here's the details of that. On February 7th, Karen Sill, a 9-year-old girl, is pronounced dead from measles. On February 10th, Monica Johnson, a classmate, is also pronounced dead. Monica is one of 11 children in the home, all of whom are unimmunized. Monica's father is a teacher at the school. Quote, I feel very confident in my belief in the way I've raised my children, he says. Monica is something that God has given us and now has taken away. After Karen Still's death, Ross meets with Reverend Charles Reinert, who was the pastor at the Faith Tabernacle Church. Quote, he was soft-spoken, the consummate gentleman, says Ross, but he drove us nuts. We told him we needed to vaccinate everyone in the school, but he said the families wouldn't let us do it. On February 12th, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Ross, we're going to go through a series of court steps of what happened in our city at the time. This was step 1. Ross obtains a court order to visit the families, but they refuse to let him touch the children. All he can do is walk in and look through the door to see how they're doing. Most of the families, quote, most of the families had 6, 8, 10, 12 kids because they didn't believe in birth control, says Ross. There were also a lot of kids who were physically or mentally disabled because they all had in-house deliveries. Even if the kids were born breech, they didn't do a C-section. It was like the old days. Ross finds the children appear well. Quote, these kids had the rash, they were lying in bed, but they were alert, conversant, and appeared well hydrated. Ross at this point pleads with the parents to let him know if their children get any sicker. On February 15th, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer. On February 14th, police are called to the home of Lynette Milnes, who was pronounced dead. Milnes doesn't attend the Faith Tabernacle Church, but her sister does. Lynette's 7 brothers and sisters are all unimmunized. Quote, when another kid turned up at the morgue, I checked my list and realized she was on it, said Ross. I had just called the mother and she told me her kids were fine. She lied to me, he said. At this point, Ross refers the case to District Attorney Ron Castile, who considers filing criminal charges against the parents, but demurs. Quote, unfortunately, when the parent is willing to risk the death of their children because of religious belief, says Castile, it's unlikely that the threat of prosecution will in any way act as a deterrent. So now we get to step 2. Ross realizes that the information he's getting from parents is inaccurate, so he gets a court order to physically examine the children. He enlists the residents at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, which is where I was at the time, and St. Christopher's Hospital to go door to door. Quote, it was one of the more inspiring moments in my 30 years in healthcare, says Ross. These are busy people on call every third night, yet they were happy to do it. On February 15th, this headline appeared in the Philadelphia Daily News. In the early morning of February 15th, Nancy Evans, a 5-year-old from north central Philadelphia, dies from measles. Nancy doesn't belong to the Faith Tabernacle Church. Rather, she belongs to the First Century Gospel Church, another faith healing group, a large faith healing group in the city. Also on February 15th, Tina Louise Johnson, the 13-year-old sister of Monica Johnson, dies on the day of Monica's funeral. Neither Nancy Evans nor Tina Louise Johnson were taken to a doctor when their illnesses worsened. So, 5 children have now died in 10 days. You have to get a sense for this. I mean, I lived through this, so I remember it well. This is 30 years into the development of a measles vaccine, and you have an epidemic that is sweeping across the city. This city is now in the midst of one of the worst epidemics in the United States and was in, frankly, a panic. In the United States, about 1 out of every 1,000 infected children typically die of measles. In some developing world countries, that mortality rate can reach as high as 1 in 300. But in Philadelphia, in February of 1991, 4 of 150 children with measles who attend the Faith Tabernacle Church are dead. That is a rate of 1 in 35. So, the CDC, struck by the power of this epidemic, sends a team to investigate. The team was headed by Bill Atkinson. The question he was asked to answer was this circulating strain in Philadelphia more virulent than other strains that were found throughout the country? What he finds is that the measles cases, deaths have nothing to do with the circulating strain and everything to do with the parents. Children are dying because they aren't getting intravenous fluids for their severe dehydration or oxygen for their pneumonia. What they're getting instead is prayer in the hopes that that will make them better. On February 18th, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer. It's children stricken with measles, church puts faith in God's healing. So at this point, although he had been silent, frankly, up until this point, at least to the media, Charles Reinert speaks out. Quote, the devil has tried to put fear in people's hearts. Job was robbed of everything he had. As he went through the trial, he learned from it. There is no fear when you can see God on your side. Reinert sees deaths in his church as a test of his faith, a test he has every intention of passing. It's drawing us all together, he says. Now we get to step 3. Ross asks the mayor, who is Wilson Good, to obtain a court order to hospitalize children who are critically ill. So we've gone from looking at children through the door to physically examining to now, if you physically examine them and you realize that they are critically ill, that you now have a court order to hospitalize them. With the telephone number of a judge in hand, residents meaning interns and residents from Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and St. Chris's Hospital, examine children from Faith Tabernacle's church. Quote, it was like entering a time warp, said Mark Jaffe, who headed the St. Chris's team. With the exception of the fact that they stay at home and watch their children die from measles, they seem like wonderful people. On February 18th, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Philadelphia compels hospitalization in measles case. So this was the first example. Daniel Kern, who was a 4-year-old, develops measles pneumonia. Healthcare workers insist on admitting the child to the hospital. Parents politely but firmly refuse. So Ross calls city solicitor Sharice Lilly, who calls family court judge Edward Summers, who gets an emergency order to hospitalize the boy. At the same time, a second child, a 1-year-old named Bianca Carpina, is also hospitalized against her parents' will, but they are hospitalized. So Philadelphia measles epidemic at this point is at its peak. At CHOP, we're at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, 82 children had been seen in the emergency department and 28 had been hospitalized. At St. Chris's, which is actually closer to the Faith Tabernacle Church, 250 children were seen in the emergency department and 3 are being hospitalized every week. Remember, the measles epidemic we're seeing now in this country is about 600 strong. That's for the entire country for the entire year so far. And to imagine this has just been going on this month in the city of Philadelphia. Ross and his team have now visited 80 families and 500 children, but predicts, quote, correctly, there will be more measles deaths in the city of Philadelphia. On February 21st, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Daily News. Philadelphia is now a feared destination. 2 nearby schools cancel trips to the city. The city prints 50,000 educational pamphlets and is vaccinating hundreds of school children every week. The state of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, sends $100,000 in federal funds to help. On February 27, 1991, Mayor Wilson Goode asked City Solicitor's Office to obtain a court order to forcibly vaccinate children, which is to say, to compel parents to vaccinate their children against their will. Remembering that this has never happened before in United States history. So let's go through that. According to the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution, states are permitted to compel vaccination of their citizens. This really stems from the famous 1905 United States Supreme Court ruling in Jacobson v. Massachusetts. It occurred when there was an outbreak of smallpox in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The Cambridge Board of Health required a smallpox vaccine, or if you didn't get a vaccine, you had to pay a $5 fine, which was in 1905 not a small amount of money. Henning Jacobson, who was a Lutheran minister, refused both. He refused the vaccine, he refused to pay the fine, and ultimately that case worked its way from local courts to district courts to state courts to the United States Supreme Court, where Justice John Marshall Harlan writing for the majority, stated the following. Quote, the liberty secured by the Constitution of the United States does not import an absolute right to be wholly freed from restraint. There are manifold restraints to which every person is necessarily subject for the common good. Society based on the rule that each one is a law unto himself would soon be confronted with anarchy and disorder. Now, this issue came up before the United States Supreme Court one more time. That was 17 years later in the case of Zucht v. King. Rosalind Zucht was a high school student who was expelled from Brackenridge High School in San Antonio, Texas, for refusing to get a smallpox vaccine. The difference between her case and the Jacobson case was there was not an outbreak of smallpox at the time in San Antonio, Texas. Didn't matter. There was the Supreme Court, again, via unanimous decision, granted states broad rights to impose health regulations such as vaccination. And that was it. That's the only 2 times that this has gone to the United States Supreme Court. Things, however, started to dissemble in 1966 in front of the New York State Assembly, once again showing that bad things come from New York. I'm sorry, I'm a Philadelphian. You know, the Giants, the Mets, the Yankees. Okay. All right, just kidding, sort of. Okay, so the at this point, the New York State was considering a bill requiring polio vaccine for school entry, a bill that passed easily by a vote of 150 to 2. But the 2 people who dissented against that dissented because the bill excluded parents whose religion forbade vaccination. That was a direct result of the lobbying efforts of Christian Scientists. So in 1972, William Mayer took advantage of that New York State decision, successfully claiming that his First Amendment rights had been violated, basically saying that you can't discriminate against me because I'm not a Christian Scientist. I mean, up until that point, there had been a number of times in a variety of states, a number of citizens had tried to go against that U.S. Supreme Court, ruling by saying, you're discriminating against me on the basis of my religion, that you're violating my First Amendment rights to practice religion freely, but they always lost because the response was, we're not discriminating against you because all religions are treated equally. With this New York State law on the books, now there was essentially a preference for Christian Scientists, and that is what Mayer argued successfully in this particular case. And as a consequence of that, 41 states have religious exemptions to vaccination. New York is one of them, and so is Pennsylvania. On February 28, 1991, this headline appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer. City will seek court order for measles shots. Now, go back a step. So this was the seminal moment. The Faith Tabernacle Church and the First Century Gospel Church were now about to be the first churches that had their children, at least had the potential that their children could be forcibly vaccinated against their will. Now remember, at the time, the state of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, already had a religious exemptions to vaccination on the books. That was on the books. And so, not surprisingly, both of these groups went to the American Civil Liberties Union to defend them. And this is a group, the ACLU, that has certainly been willing to take both at that time and before that time unpopular cases, and up to this time, unpopular cases. So for example, in Florida in 2009, the ACLU defended the right of the Dove World Outreach Center to have their children wear T-shirts to school that said Islam is of the devil. Similarly, in 2007, in eastern Missouri, associated with Westboro Baptist Church, the ACLU defended the right of this church to protest at the funerals of soldiers. The church's belief was that the sin of homosexuality that was practiced in the United States was being punished as evidenced by Americans that were dying in the war, including recently the war in Iraq, and so they protested with signs that said things like what you see there, wearing these hateful shirts that represents their website, godhatesfags.com. And probably most famously, the ACLU is known for representing the rights of neo-Nazis to march down the streets of Skokie, Illinois in the mid-1970s, Skokie, Illinois being a community that had a number of Jewish residents, including those who were recently Holocaust survivors, prompting actually the humor magazine, The Onion, to more recently remark, ACLU defends neo-Nazis' right to burn down ACLU headquarters. So in any case, it was the anticipation of all of us that were watching this happen in Philadelphia that the ACLU was going to be perfectly willing to take on the case of these parents and their rights to not be vaccinated, because there was a law on the books in our Commonwealth that said that that was their right. But on March 2nd, 1991, this headline appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer. There is certainly a free exercise of religion claimed by the parents, said Deborah Levy of the Philadelphia chapter of the ACLU, but there is also a competing claim that parents don't have the right to martyr their children. I don't think we've walked away from our principles here. What Deborah Levy was echoing was actually a 1945 U.S. Supreme Court ruling in the sort of famous Prince v. Massachusetts case, which was really a child labor law case having to do with Jehovah's Witnesses and their capacity to pamphleteer late at night with young children. But the statement actually in that ruling was, while one has the freedom to martyr yourself to your religion, you do not have the freedom under identical circumstances to martyr your child to your religion. This is that phrase sort of echoing back. So on March 2nd, 1991, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer. We had now broken new ground. We had for the first time been able to compel children to be vaccinated against their parents' will. We had enough cases, and there were enough deaths in our city that happened. Now, Jerome Balter was the lawyer for the parents of the Faith Tabernacle Church, and he protested Summers' decision. Quote, their healing is dependent on their faith, he says. They believe that's the right thing to do for their children. The judge, however, ruled in favor of the city, and so what Balter did was he took his case to the Pennsylvania Superior Court of Appeals. Now, the state Superior Court judge was Vincent Cirillo, and he was in charge of that appeal. Sean Lacey was the public defender representing the children. So there were two lawyers, lawyers that represented the parents, lawyers that represented the children. During that hearing, Cirillo notices a pained expression on Lacey's face. Are you ill, he asks. Lacey had just been handed a note concerning a 20-month-old boy, James Jones, whose parents are members of the Faith Tabernacle Church. And the next day, this headline appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer. James Jones, by the way, had died of encephalitis. Actually died in our hospital eventually, so I saw his death. At this point, Balter argues that parents are now willing to allow sick children to be admitted to the hospital, but they still refuse to be vaccinated. Balter implies that treatment is as good as prevention, something that has clearly been contradicted by events of the previous month. On March 9th, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Daily News, 5 children get court-ordered vaccinations. And on June 7th, 1991, the measles epidemic slows. Typically, measles is a disease of the late winter and early spring, says Bob Levinson, director of disease control. When the warm weather comes, the cases disappear. Charles Reinert, however, pastor of the Faith Tabernacle Church, has a different interpretation. Focusing on the children who in his church who had survived, the infection without medical care, he said, "We believe God has provided his faithfulness." Even though at this point, in his church, you either had previously been naturally infected or you were currently infected. That was basically your choice. So on December 3rd, 1992, the group from the CDC that had come down to investigate our outbreak published their report in the Pediatric Infectious Diseases Journal. Among church members, there were 486 people who were infected and 6 killed. Among non-church members, there were 938 people infected and 3 killed. One city, one season, largely in 1 month. All 9 deaths were in children. The attack rate in church members was about 1,000-fold greater than in the surrounding community. In 2013, the CDC has identified about 30,000 children whose parents have chosen not to vaccinate them for religious reasons. That number actually is only increasing. A lot of the outbreaks that you're seeing now of measles, pertussis, to some extent mumps, and to a lesser extent bacterial meningitis, are people who are choosing not to vaccinate, in one case for so-called with a philosophical exemption, but the fallback exemption is typically the religious exemption. And frankly, given the underreporting and the insular nature of some faith healing groups, I think that number, even in 2013, was likely to be much larger. So I'm going to close with this, which gives us plenty of time for questions. I would argue that these are not religious acts. I think that if religions teach us anything, it's to care about our children. It's to care about our families. It's to care about our neighbors. It's to care about our communities. It bothers me, actually, that we allow these kinds of protections in the name of religion when I would argue that they're profoundly unreligious. So I'll close with this. Why do we allow such a profoundly unreligious act to be performed in the name of religion? I'm not religious, actually, but at least, although my family is intensely religious, and you know, the minute people generally say the word, "This is my faith, this is the way I honor God," we all stand back, and that's okay to a point. But the point is here, when people put their children in harm's way, because I think when that it's not religion anymore when it causes you to act inhumanely. So I'll stop there. Thanks for your attention.